He was 9 years old when they handed him the most powerful throne in England. He was 15 when he died. And in those 6 years, almost every adult around him treated him like a tool, a prop, a signature on a document. But here's what they never counted on. Edward knew exactly what was happening. And that makes his story not just tragic, it makes it terrifying. This is the story of a boy who was brilliant, deeply religious, politically ruthless for his age, and completely systematically exploited by the most powerful men in Tudor England. His uncle stole his authority. His replacement uncle stole even more. And when Edward's body started failing, they didn't grieve. They plotted. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand why historians consider Edward VI one of the most tragic what-ifs in English history, and why the men who used him deserve far more infamy than they get. Let's start at the beginning, with a man who wanted a son so badly he destroyed a country to get one. Henry VIII. You know the name? 6 wives. A reformation. A man so enormous in history that he swallows everyone around him. But to understand Edward, you have to understand what Edward represented to Henry. Not a son, a solution. Henry had been king since 1509. For decades, his marriages had produced girls, miscarriages, and dead boys. The Tudor dynasty was barely 2 generations old. Without a male heir, it risked collapsing the moment Henry died. This wasn't just vanity. In the 16th century, a kingdom without a clear male successor was an invitation for civil war. Henry had seen it happen. He'd read about it. And he was absolutely determined it would not happen to him. Then came Jane Seymour, wife number 3. Quiet, compliant, and unlike her predecessors, she delivered. On October 12, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, Jane gave birth to a boy. The boy was named Edward. The whole kingdom celebrated. Bonfires were lit. Te Deums were sung in churches across England. Jane Seymour died 12 days later. Henry grieved, genuinely it seems, but he had his heir. And that heir was now everything. Edward's upbringing was not like other children's, not even like other royal children's. He was kept in near isolation for health reasons. Tudor medicine was terrified of infection, and this child was irreplaceable. His household was scrubbed daily. Contact with the outside world was carefully controlled. He had companions, carefully selected boys his age, but his social world was tiny. What he did have was education, and in that Henry spared absolutely nothing. Edward was tutored by some of the greatest scholars of the age, men steeped in Renaissance humanism and the Protestant Reformation. He learned Latin, Greek, French, Spanish. He studied theology, philosophy, astronomy, music. By the age of 6, he was writing letters in Latin. By 8, he was debating theology. The tutors who shaped him most were committed Protestants. This was not accidental. England under Henry had broken from Rome, but Henry's Reformation had been political, not theological. He still believed in much of Catholic doctrine. Edward's tutors were preparing something different. They were raising the first king of England who would be Protestant to his bones, a boy who would one day have the power to complete what his father had only half started. But there's something else about Edward that history tends to skip. He was sharp, unusually so. His tutors weren't just educating a pupil, they were struggling to keep up with one. He kept a personal journal. He wrote policy papers. He had opinions, strong ones, and he wasn't shy about voicing them even as a child. This is not the portrait of a passive puppet. This is someone who, had he lived, might have been one of the most formidable rulers England ever produced. Keep this in your mind as we go forward, because what happens next is even more brutal once you know who he actually was. January 28, 1547. Henry VIII dies. Edward is 9 years old. He is now King of England. Before Henry even died, the men around him were already positioning. The Regency Council that Henry had appointed to govern until Edward came of age was, on paper, balanced. A collection of nobles and reformers meant to share power. In practice, it lasted about 5 minutes. The man who moved fastest was Edward Seymour, the new king's uncle, Jane Seymour's brother. Within weeks of Henry's death, Seymour had maneuvered himself into a new title, Lord Protector of the Realm, not just a regent, not just an advisor, the Lord Protector, effectively the ruler of England. He also granted himself a new title, Duke of Somerset. We'll call him Somerset from here on, because that's how history knows him. And history does not know him kindly. Somerset wasn't evil exactly. He was ambitious, self-serving, and catastrophically bad at sharing power. He launched an expensive, disastrous war with Scotland. He mismanaged the English economy. He alienated the very people he needed to govern effectively, and the entire time he ruled in Edward's name. Edward signed the documents. Edward's face was on the coins. But the decisions were Somerset's. What's remarkable is that Edward, even as a child, knew this wasn't right. His journal entries from this period show a boy who was observing everything, absorbing the politics, forming judgments, waiting. He couldn't rule yet, but he was watching. Somerset's grip on power lasted 3 years before it collapsed. By 1549, England was in chaos. There were rebellions in Cornwall and Norfolk. The economy was a mess. The council had had enough. Somerset was arrested, stripped of the protectorship, eventually executed. And Edward, 12 years old now, watched as the man who had used him for 3 years was replaced by someone even more dangerous. His name was John Dudley. He didn't call himself Lord Protector. He was too clever for that. He gave himself the title Duke of Northumberland and governed through the council. But make no mistake about what he was. Northumberland was the most ruthless political operator of the Tudor era, a man who could smile warmly while calculating exactly how to destroy you. His relationship with Edward was different from Somerset's. Northumberland didn't ignore the boy. He cultivated him. He gave Edward more access to council meetings. He talked to him as an equal. He encouraged Edward's Protestant beliefs and made himself the champion of the Reformation. Edward adored him. In his journal, he writes about Northumberland with warmth and respect. This is what makes Northumberland so much more sinister than Somerset. He didn't rule around Edward. He shaped Edward. He used the king's own intelligence and convictions as instruments of his own power. Under Northumberland's influence, England's Protestant Reformation accelerated dramatically. The new Book of Common Prayer, the abolition of the Mass, the stripping of Catholic imagery from churches. These were genuinely Edward's convictions. But Northumberland made sure the reforms also served Northumberland. When the church's assets were redistributed, Northumberland's friends got the best of them. And then in 1552, everything changed. Edward got sick. The exact nature of Edward's illness is still debated by historians. Tuberculosis is the most widely accepted answer, though some have suggested it may have been complicated by other conditions, pulmonary disease accelerated by the medical treatments of the era. What isn't debated is how quickly he declined. In early 1553, Edward was well enough to appear in public. By spring, he was barely able to leave his room. By summer, he was dying, and Northumberland, the man who had spent 2 years making Edward trust him, watched this happen and did not grieve. He planned. Here's the crisis Northumberland faced. Henry VIII's original succession, still enshrined in law, placed Edward's half-sister Mary next in line. Mary was Catholic, deeply, uncompromisingly Catholic. If Mary became queen, everything Northumberland had built, every reform, every land grant, every alliance, would be at risk. His enemies would return to power. His own head might follow. So Northumberland did what desperate men with too much power always do. He improvised. The plan was this. Edward would alter the succession. Instead of Mary, and instead of Elizabeth, the Protestant half-sister who was also inconvenient, the throne would pass to Lady Jane Grey. Jane was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister. She was Protestant. She was 16 years old. She was also, as of May 1553, Northumberland's daughter-in-law. He had arranged her marriage to his own son just weeks before. The document changing the succession was called the Device for the Succession. Edward signed it. Now, here is where it gets complicated, and where historians still argue. Did Northumberland pressure a dying teenager into signing a document that served Northumberland's interests almost exclusively? Almost certainly yes. But Edward was also genuinely terrified of what a Catholic queen would mean for England and for Protestantism. His motivations and Northumberland's overlapped in exactly the way Northumberland had spent 2 years engineering. The boy's genuine faith became the justification for a coup. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553. He was 15 years old. He had been king for 6 years and never once, for a single day, actually ruled. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. She lasted 9 days. The country didn't want her. Support collapsed almost instantly. Northumberland was arrested. He recanted his Protestantism on the scaffold, hoping it might save him. It didn't. He was executed in August 1553. Jane Grey was executed in February 1554, 16 years old. Another victim of Northumberland's ambition, though history sometimes forgets to say it that way. Mary I became queen. She reversed the Reformation, and she went down in history as Bloody Mary. Edward's reign, when you stand back and look at it, is a long study in what happens when a child is placed at the center of adult ambition. Everyone who governed in his name, Somerset, Northumberland, told themselves they were serving the king. Neither of them were. They were serving themselves and using Edward's name as the legal cover to do it. But here's what I keep coming back to. Edward knew. He wasn't blind. His journals, his letters, his interactions with council members, they show a young man who understood the game being played around him far better than his handlers would have liked. He just couldn't do anything about it. Not yet. And he ran out of time. Here is the question that haunts Edward VI's story. What if he had lived? Not to 16 or 17. What if he'd lived to 30, to 40? The signs point to something remarkable. He had intellectual firepower that surprised even his tutors. He had political instincts, raw, unformed, but real. He had genuine religious conviction that gave him moral clarity even when those around him had none. And he had something rare in a monarch. He actually seemed to care about governance, about policy, about England as a concept, not just a possession. His discourse on the reformation of abuses, written when he was 13, proposed systematic reforms to the English poor laws, to the military, to the administration of the realm. 13 years old, writing policy papers. We can't know what England would have looked like under a 30-year-old Edward VI. We can't know if his Protestant England would have avoided the religious wars that were tearing Europe apart. What we know is that he never got the chance. 6 years of watching men use his name. 6 years of signing their documents and wearing their crown. And then he was gone. England has remembered Henry VIII. England has celebrated Elizabeth I. Edward VI sits between them, largely forgotten, the boy who was supposed to secure the dynasty, who was used by every man around him, and who died before he could ever be himself. That's not just sad, that's an indictment of Somerset, of Northumberland, of a system that placed a child on the throne and immediately began looting the treasury of his future. If you want to understand the Tudors, really understand them, you have to reckon with Edward. Not as Henry's footnote, not as the boy between two famous queens. As a person, a brilliant, trapped, utterly failed person, who deserved so much better than the 6 years he got. If this video made you think differently about Edward VI, let me know in the comments. And if you have a Tudor figure you want me to cover next, drop the name below. Subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one.